In the first week of summer, when the river sat low and sullen, and the town had learned to speak in coupons and apologetic smiles, Keziah Moreland signed her name onto a deed that everyone else had laughed away. The mill crouched at the bend, like an old dog left out in the rain, slate roof missing teeth, windows webbed with cracks, the old brick blackened by decades of steam and grain. She tucked the deed into the inner pocket of her coat, as if it could feel warmer closer to her sternum, and she stood facing that hulking ruin with a private, steadying breath that smelled of wet limestone and milkweed. The realtor had driven off fast, like someone leaving a dare. Cars slowed on the frontage road because there was always sport in watching a person step into the mouth of a bad idea. Keziah felt eyes on her, but she kept her gaze on the arched doorway and the rust-red padlock sulking across it. She carried two things, a thermos of black tea and a set of bolt cutters. The tea steamed in the river wind. The cutters bit through the lock with an obedient finality that startled her. She pushed the door. The mill exhaled a cold breath at her, the smell of iron and mouse nests and histories nobody had recorded. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. Her boots made careful sounds on the damp floor, each footstep ghosted by the swish of swallows above the rafters. On the far wall, a manufacturer's plaque survived under a skin of grime. Turbine Co., 1911. Her fingertips found the raised letters. Underneath the feel of the metal was an old hum inside her, one she'd listened to since she was small, the sense that if you stand long enough, the building will tell you how to help it keep standing. "Hello," she said, and felt foolish, then less so. "I'm Keziah. I'm not here to strip you for parts." She let the words be simple. The building did not answer, but the swallows circled lower, and one dared the open door and arrowed out into sun. That would be her later, if she did this right. Find the opening, fold her pins through it, and make something of the light. She knelt and set the thermos on a knee-high block. She had not told the town her plan because she needed to hear it echo in this room first. Ovens. Not just one, banks of them. Mouths like half-moons fed by heat that never quits. Benches. Sinks. A walk-in cooler that didn't wheeze. A line of volunteers wearing aprons that did not pretend to be uniforms. A grain room. A wall of hooks for coats and backpacks. Tables where someone could sit without buying anything and still be asked how their day went. On the second level, the clatter of sacks and the purr of a rebuilt turbine turning river push into flour and light. Free bread, soup that made winter softer, a place to work the day's fear into something edible. The doubt came, like it always did, efficient and well-practiced. "You don't have that kind of money. The electrical is a death trap. The inspectors will gut you. The river will flood and take everything." She acknowledged each voice like she was checking names on a list, and then she pictured the faces that had crowded the back door of the shelter last month. The shy teenage boy who kept his hands in his sleeves, the woman with the cracked lip who whispered "thank you" like it would shatter if she said it louder, the old veteran who insisted on sweeping after he ate. If a place could decide who it wanted to belong to, she wanted this one to belong to them. By noon, she had a card table set up near the door and her notebook open. She wrote the way she worked with her hands. No fuss, straight lines, little boxes to corral the enormity. Phase 1, assessment, stabilizing, permits. Phase 2, foundation repairs, roof, power. Phase 3, oven build, kitchen, turbine room. Phase 4, distribution network. Phase 5, training days. And then she ran a line down the margin and wrote the name of every person she would need. Mason, electrician, plumber, millwright, carpenter, roofer, hydrologist, inspector, farmer, neighbor, stranger, donor. She underlined neighbor twice. The first neighbor arrived before she finished her tea. His forearms were seasoned with drywall dust, and he wore the kind of baseball cap that had a permanent sweat line baked in. He stood in the doorway like a man stepping into a story he'd already decided the ending to. "Heard someone bought the old Riverjaw," he said. "I did," Keziah said. Sun knifed in behind him and lit the dust into a storm of gold. "What for?" His tone suggested there were only wrong answers. "Food," she said. "Bread. A kitchen that doesn't close. A mill that runs again." He looked past her at the sagging catwalk and the iron skeleton of the conveyor. "Bread?" "And soup," she said, because once you tell the truth, it gets easier to keep telling it. "And bagged produce, and a warm room where the calendar doesn't shut you out. Free for the ones who need it. Pay what you can for anyone else." The man's jaw worked. "Lady," he said finally, "you ever try to get anything through permit in this town? The inspectors will eat you before your ovens do." "Then I'll feed them first," she said. It came out gentler than it sounded in her head, and his mouth twitched like he hadn't expected to like her. "I'm Orrin," he said. "I hang drywall. You'll need walls that don't weep." He squinted up at the beams. "You'll need a lot of things." "Will you come back?" she asked. He didn't answer that, not directly. "I'll bring a ladder. That roof's gonna swallow the next rain." He tapped the door jamb with a knuckle like you knock wood for luck. "You get the permits? You holler when they try to kill you with paper." After he left, she stood in the middle of the room and listened again. The mill had a noise you could only hear when you went very still, a patient ticking from deep in the belly where the shaft ran to the old turbine chamber. The river was low, but it was never nothing. Keziah followed the sound to the iron hatch door, tugged, and felt the resistance of a thing that has been ignored long enough to forget how to open. She fetched her crowbar from the car, braced herself, and put her weight into it. The hatch gave like an old knee, reluctant but not broken. The turbine chamber breathed cool on her face. A low corridor led to the riverside, where a steel cylinder as big as a horse lay asleep in the gloom. She crouched. Silt covered everything in a velvet pad, and fish scales glinted here and there like confetti from an ancient party. A wooden swallow's nest was glued to a curve of concrete, and when she shined her phone, 2 moons blinked inside. Chicks. She thought of moving them, and immediately hated the thought. You don't evict the ones who know how to survive a place. You ask them how. Back upstairs, she set her phone on the card table and called the power company. "I need a service panel inspection," she said. "Then the city planning office. I need to schedule a preliminary walkthrough." She called a foundation contractor with a good reputation for not lying, a roofer who didn't flinch at century-old angles, and a millwright 3 towns over whose website was straight from 2003 and therefore probably honest. "Why a mill?" the millwright asked after she explained. "Because the river still runs, and people still need bread." He was quiet long enough she thought the call had dropped. Then, "I'm retired, but I'll come look." By evening, the mill had begun to learn her outlines, where her tools lived, the particular heft of her body in its hallways, the rhythm of her breath as she worked. She swept a path wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. She taped a handwritten sign to the door. "This building is for making food and friends. If you're here for either, come in. If you're here for neither, go fish." She slept on a cot in the office that night and woke to rain, then to a knock. The city planning office sent 2 inspectors, a square-shouldered man whose name tag announced D. Lifton, and a woman with a precise bun and eyes that had seen their share of kitchen lies. Keziah stood them by the card table and laid her plans out flat. "You want to put a commercial kitchen in a structure with no updated electrical, no fire suppression, and a questionable roof," Lifton said, flipping pages. "Yes," Keziah said, "and a turbine to offset the draw on the grid. Grain processing upstairs, kitchen and ovens on the main floor. We'll reinforce the joists. We'll stay ahead of code, not behind it." The woman, her name tag said K. Uecta, tapped a fingernail on the plan. "And you want to feed how many?" "As many as show up," Keziah said. Her throat got dry and she took a sip of her tea. "At least 2,000 a day in peak weeks." Her eyebrows climbed, then lowered again. "You're not a restaurant." "No," Keziah said. "A kitchen that belongs to the town."
Lifton, harumphed, a verb made into a man. You'll need egress updates, sprinklers, ADA compliance, pest control plan, grease trap, exterior grading, flood mitigation. Yes, Keziah said to each like she was catching dishes someone threw. Huerta held her gaze. Miss Moreland, I grew up with a mother who made $5 stretch into a week. I've seen what a pot of soup can do to a neighborhood. I'm not your enemy, but we do this right or not at all. People get sick from love as easily as from neglect when it comes to kitchens. I want right, Keziah said. I want careful. I want inspectors who have my number. She slid a paper across the table. I set an appointment with a hydrologist on Friday. There's an old sluice gate upstream that can spare us flooding if we coordinate, and the turbine will have proper screening. Huerta pressed her lips together. I'll schedule preliminary. No cooking until you pass life safety. Lifton scribbled something and left without looking up, either because he didn't want to like her or because he already did and was mad about it.
The millwright showed on Wednesday driving a pickup that had a coat of honest rust. He was short, with big knuckles and a gait like he'd married gravity long ago. "Name's Rook," he said, as if he'd been named for chess or birds and wasn't sure which had come first. He listened more than he spoke, which made Keziah like him immediately. They went down into the turbine chamber and stood like two surgeons over a sleeping patient. He lay on his side to look under the casing, then rolled on his back for perspective and laughed up at the concrete ceiling. "She's not dead," he said, "just lonesome." How much to make her not lonesome? He scratched his jaw. "Two ways. Old way, rebuild her as is, bet your life on parts nobody stocks in my memory. New way, keep the bones, new guts. Variable speed generator up top, computerized governor. Safe, modern. Costs more at the start, pays you back by not killing you." "New way," Keziah said, before fear could invent excuses, "but keep the bones." They made lists, then lists of lists. Ruck showed her where the shaft needed truing and how to listen for wobble in a bearing by the way a screwdriver trembles between your finger and the metal. "Feel is most of millwrighting," he said. "Feel and patience. Buildings hate to be rushed." "People too," she said. "Sometimes," he allowed, and it felt like a compliment. By the second week, Orrin had indeed come back, lugging a ladder like a confession. He brought a roofer named Lita who wore her tool belt like a championship belt and walked the ridgeline with no drama. "You need slate patched now, not replaced," Lita told Keziah. "We'll tarp over the worst, full tear-off later. And we're putting in a proper lightning rod unless you want to watch your ovens learn how to pray." "I don't mind prayer," Keziah said. "I mind fire trucks." They laughed, and in the laughter Keziah could feel the first little click of this maybe working, of a plan taking the shape of a thing that would exist whether people believed in it or not. Not everyone laughed. Across the river, a developer's banner had creeped up like moss. Pike Riverfront, luxury lofts coming 2027. Keziah saw it the same morning the first article about her appeared in the town's paper. The headline did not pretend to be kind. "Woman buys rot, plans to bake bread," as if both phrases were equally absurd. The article quoted anonymous sources who said she'd moved back to town after certain failures elsewhere. When she put the paper down, Keziah noticed she'd smudged flour across Pike's phone number because she'd been testing dough hydration in bowls set on the card table like school science. She let herself think about what they meant by failures. A warehouse kitchen in another city where the landlord doubled the rent and the board panicked and she couldn't save it all. A co-op that fractured around a rumor. The week she lost her mother and forgot how to stand up for 3 days and then stood up anyway. Failure wasn't rot. Failure was compost if you turned it. She added new boxes to her notebook. Media, neighbor meetings, city council. She wrote careful language, then crossed half of it out. She reminded herself that people protect what they understand and love, so she had to make this mill legible. On Friday night, she swept the floor twice and rolled a long table into the center of the room. She set out a pot of carrot ginger soup and sliced bread from a friend's bakery and paper cups with garden mint tucked into each like flags.
She hung a string of borrowed festival lights. At 6 o'clock, the door opened and didn't stop opening. Whoever the paper had stirred up came to see the spectacle, and the ones who had been waiting for hope came to see if it had found an address. Keziah stood on a milk crate and spoke without a microphone. She was not a natural speech maker. She did not try to sound like one. She told them about the turbine and the ovens and the plan to pay farmers more than commodity prices for ugly produce that could be turned into perfect soup. She told them about the kitchen hours and the bagging line and the Tuesday class where kids could learn to make bread like it mattered, because it did. She told them about health codes and inspectors and how nobody would ever be asked for a paycheck stub at the door. From the back, a voice cut the air like a low saw. "So who's paying for your dreams?" A man with a pink face and a perfect polo leaned against a support beam like it owed him money. Keziah had never met Darren, but she recognized him the way you recognize winter. He smelled faintly of cologne and entitlement. "We are," Keziah said. "We as in all of us. Donors, grants, contracts with farms, event rentals when we're legal, and 1,000 small gifts that don't make the paper." He smiled a wolfy, pitying smile and swept a hand to include the cracked walls. "What about asbestos, lead, liability? Are you going to write hope on an insurance binder? We are abating what's needed abating, and we're insured like grown-ups. We are not reckless. We are careful." He clicked his tongue. "Careful gets you exactly one thing: slow failure." A murmur rolled through the room. People feel when someone wants them to choose sides. Keziah could feel her pulse in her thumbs. "Sir, I won't keep you from your lofts. Please don't keep us from our bread." He laughed like rain on tin. "You think I'm your enemy. I'm simply gravity. Watch out for inspectors, Miss Moreland. Gravity loves them." He left a business card near the soup like a cop leaving a warning. After he was gone, people came closer, not farther. A woman pressed $20 into Keziah's palm and refused to take change for her cup of soup. A boy asked if he could volunteer after school. A man with a neck tattoo said he once worked the night shift in a bakery and could help fix the old mixers if they ever got mixers. Lita announced she was forming a roof day. Oren handed Keziah a clipping of an onion skin he'd caught on his cuff and said, "For your compost." She tucked it all away like small living inheritance. Permits were as bad as everyone said, and somehow worth it. Weeks sorted themselves into an alphabet of tasks. A was for asbestos abatement suits that made her sweat in winter. B was for bearings. C was for concrete that needed honest work. D for donors. E for exit. F for fire suppression engineered to be invisible until it mattered. G for grease trap. H for hydrology in the way Ruck taught her to read the river. Color, smell, speed, the language of current's shoulders. I for inspectors who surprised her by wanting her to succeed. J for Joist's sisters. K for kids who came on Saturdays and learned to punch down dough with a righteous calm. L for Lita, who swore at Slate as if it could hear her. M for Millwright music, the whir and click as parts aligned. N for neighbors learning the habit of bringing what they had to the table. O for ovens that existed on paper until they didn't. P for Pike, who sent a letter through his lawyer alleging her project created public nuisance by attracting undesirables, to which Keziah responded with a public picnic and an invitation for him to attend. He did not.
The first real scare came the day the health inspector found a raccoon paw print where a paw print should not be, inside the dry goods closet. Keziah pressed her tongue against her teeth to keep from cursing. "We'll seal the gaps," she said. "We'll bait with peppermint oil and steel wool." Huerta nodded, but made a note with a dot that looked stern. "I'm not your enemy," she said again, softer. "But this is where I get hated if I pretend I don't see what I see." They found the entrance, a hand-sized gap in the brick where mortar had forgone its promise. Oren mixed new mortar under latest commentary. "You'd think time lived on bread and the walls were a snack."
They sealed it, shored the shelving, and learned to keep flour in sealed bins with clips like snapping turtles. In October, the turbine turned for the first time. It happened with less drama than paper cuts. A click, a sigh, and then a hum that felt like a second heart had started inside the building. The LED readout winked a number that meant more than she could say aloud. Leda climbed down the ladder and hugged a rook, then pretended she hadn't. Oren whistled a dirge that sounded suspiciously like a love song. Keziah put her forehead against the generator panel and said thank you. To who, she didn't specify. They tested the ovens in November. Old kilns had been salvaged from a school that had replaced them. The new refractory bricks glowed like fruit when they were hot. All day they coaxed flame and listened to the flues like lungs. That night they cooked nothing but onions with butter and salt and a little sage because it would steam the fear right out of a room. The whole mill smelt like a kitchen your grandmother would have recognized even if she never had one. Pike tried again. He filed a motion at the zoning board claiming their deliveries blocked the riverfront walkway. Keziah stood up in a room where voices echoed too much and explained the staggered schedule, the volunteer line, the sign-up sheet that ensured no truck idled. A man who ran the bait shop spoke for them in a voice that shook. "You think my customers don't park crooked? You gonna shut down fishing?" The motion failed by a vote. A banker with a smile precise as a seam offered a loan. "You'll need a cushion," he said, "for the unexpected." "It's all unexpected," she said. "That's the point." But she took the loan because ovens, like hope, need fuel. December brought the first 1,000 loaves. Not baked there, baked in borrowed kitchens across town. Keziah watched children write bag number 216 on paper that crinkled like new shoes. Volunteers learned the pleasure of assembly lines that made sense. One person ties, one adds the sticker with ingredients, one places the bag in a crate as if it carried a baby. The distribution map on the wall bloomed with pins. Northside Underpass, add thermoses. Lincoln Avenue Clinic, soft bread only. Senior Towers, door to door, avoid Monday when the elevator dies. Her doubts learned to wait their turn. When they came, they were specific. The south wall bulge that might mean a bigger problem, the sudden nausea at the thought of inspectors on tasting day, the bank's email reminding her about covenants she didn't remember signing. She folded each fear into the work like you fold in egg whites, delicately so you don't lose lift. A week before the grand opening, the day they would cook and serve and send home sacks that 1,000 hands had already helped weave, someone cut the lock on the river gate. They found it at dawn because Rook reads dawn like a novel. The gate was half open, the low river had licked its way into places it shouldn't be. Keziah stepped into water up to her shins in the turbine room and saw the fine silt settling on her floor like the first letter of a love she didn't want. "Who?" Oren said, not as a question, but as a prayer you ask when you already know the answer. He held the broken lock in his palm like a tooth. "We fix it first," Keziah said, voice flat, because she had to choose closed over rage until the work allowed rage to do something useful. They closed the gate with effort that made backs complain, and Rook scowled at the way the wheel stuck and said somebody knew what to do wrong and did it. Keziah did not say Pike's name aloud because names are spells and some men enjoy being summoned. The grand opening fell on the first real snow. The river wore a shawl of ice around its edges. The town showed up in the kind of coats that remember winters past, and the volunteers moved like a dance company that had learned to enjoy being corrected. The ovens burned steady. The soup was a thick green comfort. The line bent around the room and out the door and down the stairs to the river path. People patient as saints, faces softening when the steam hit them. Keziah stood at the pass and called orders to nobody because calling orders fills a room with confidence. When somebody dropped a ladle, 3 people picked up spoons. When a child started crying, someone who did not know the child knew which pocket had the good napkins. On the second day, the power hiccuped at 10 a.m. The lights blinked twice and stayed on, but the ovens took offense. A circuit board flashed a warning like a small scream. Rook and Keziah looked at each other and moved in the same direction. He opened the panel. "She wants steady," he told the turbine, "like a friend you can cajole. Don't flirt with brownouts when ovens need romance." The generator stabilized with a sigh, and Keziah realized she had been holding her breath for longer than comfort.
Pike tried once more, and not on paper. 2 nights later, the motion sensor caught 3 figures near the back door. Keziah was in the office finishing the schedule for soup teams when the alarm chirped. She did not call the police first. She went to the door with her phone light in one hand and a rolling pin in the other, because you use what's in reach. "Hello?" she called. Her voice did not tremble. She had learned that fear listens for tremble. 3 boys squinted into the light. They were too thin and too cocky, and exactly the age that thrives on dares. "We just wanted to see," one said, chin up like a blade. "Then see," Keziah said. She thumbed the deadbolt. "Come in. But I'm keeping this." She lifted the rolling pin and saw the surprise in the boys' eyes turn into something else. They shuffled in on the kind of feet that didn't want to leave footprints. She showed them the ovens, the bins of flour, the room where donated jackets hung like quiet soldiers. She gave them each a piece of dough and watched their hands learn a motion their great-grandmothers would have praised. By the time they left, the alarm had forgotten why it had chirped. One boy slipped a card back onto the table that he must have picked up on his way in. "Pike Riverfront," it said. Darren's name was scrawled across it with a line, "Call me." She burned the card in the pilot flame of the smallest oven and watched it curl into black. There are messages worth keeping and messages designed to clog your throat. January brought the cold that shines like glass. The river slowed, the turbine sang lower, and the line outside grew longer. Keziah learned to love the repetition of it. Ladle, bread, look up, say a name if you have it, learn a name if you don't, eyes to eyes, do not flinch. She went home sometimes and sat in the doorway of her apartment with her coat still on and waited for her bones to tell her she could take the coat off. When the doubt came now, it had to queue with everyone else. It learned patience. On a Wednesday that looked from the doorway exactly like the Tuesday before, a woman in a green coat stepped forward holding nothing but a photograph. "He's back," she told Keziah, voice breaking on the verb. The photograph showed a man's face emptying itself of pieces you can't put back. "He's mean when he's sober now. We don't have anywhere to go." Keziah felt the old heat rise in her, the one that used to make her say too much to the wrong people in rooms with microphones. She took the woman's hand instead and guided her to a table near the window. "Eat first. We'll call after." She glanced at Orrin. He had the phone out already. They were a small army, not of blows but of insistences. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be full. You belong in a room where no one is afraid of you. At dusk that day, the sky went the color of bruises you get from furniture. Rook listened at the back door and said, "She's rising faster than she should. Something's wrong upstream." Keziah went with him to the river gate and tasted metal in the air. The sleuth should have been half closed against a thaw that hadn't come yet. It wasn't. The wheel was stiff under her hands, and when she and Rook put their weight into it, the turn had a notch in it that felt like a plan. "Call the city. Call whoever answers when you say water." They called. The line tripped and skittered between departments like lines do when they are afraid of responsibility. "We'll send someone in the morning," a voice said. "It will be too late in the morning," Keziah said, calm as hunger. She ended the call because sometimes you feed urgency and sometimes you starve it. Snow began in beads that melted as they hit her cheeks and then changed their mind and became snow.
Oren came with tarps. Lida came with ropes. The volunteers made their own weather. One team moved the flour bins to the high rack, another wrapped the bottom shelves in plastic, a third made sandwiches because work needs protein. The mill smelled like bread and storm. Kezia's lungs felt too small. She called Huerta and got voicemail and left a message that included the words, "I am not asking permission," which she regretted as soon as she hung up and did not regret at all 10 minutes later. She called the hydrologist. He did not answer. She sent a text that simply said, "The wheel won't turn." He sent back one word, "Stuck?" And she replied with a picture of rust giving the world the finger. Rook touched the iron rem like you touch a friend's face. "There's another way," he said. And Kezia knew from the way he said it that the other way was the kind that requires someone to be braver than a plan. "How deep?" she asked. "Waist if we're lucky. Chest if the river forgot we exist. The valve is inside the penstock. If we open it, we can relieve pressure, then force the wheel to behave." He looked at her not with gallantry, but with the math of age. "I'm slow, you're not. I'll tie the line, you go. Not alone. No heroes here."
"Two's too many bodies in a pipe," he said. "One's barely enough." The storm noticed them then. The snow came harder. The river lifted her skirt and showed ankle. Kezia heard someone inside say, "Do we cancel?" And someone else say, "Cancel what? Dinner?" She wanted to be both of those people, the one who protects and the one who refuses to concede. She pulled on waders and felt the water find the unfindable seam down her right side and slide in like a thief. She did not hiss. She took the rope from Rook and looped it across her chest. Oren came to her side and threaded a second line through a carabiner like a man dressing a wound. Lida put her hands on Kezia's shoulders and looked her in the face like she had been waiting to do that since the roof. "You come back," Lida said. No flourish. A command from one stubborn thing to another. "I'll try," Kezia said, and her voice did not crack on try, which felt like growth. She stepped into the penstock. The world narrowed to iron and water and the sound of her own heart pretending it had an agenda beyond survival. The light from her headlamp found the valve wheel like a small moon in a bad dream. Her fingers went numb at the knuckle. Behind her, the rope paid out in slow, deliberate increments. Inside the mill, the ovens breathed like animals asleep. Under the windows, people waited in their coats, some with hats off, because respect makes you polite to rooms that feed you. Someone tuned a guitar with the resigned air of a man who knows he will soon be very useful. Kezia heard none of that. She heard the river in her head, the same voice it had on the day she signed the deed. Steady, indifferent, older than generosity. Her gloved hand touched the valve wheel. It did not give. She repositioned and put her shoulder into it. Something tight, deep in the mechanism, laughed at her. She put both hands on the spokes, and the water sent a current into her bones that felt like stubbornness learning a language. Behind her, the rope tightened once, twice, the signal Rook had insisted on like ritual. "You good?" She tugged back twice, for now. She breathed. She thought of dough relaxing under a warm towel. She thought of names on the distribution map. She thought of Huerta initialing the last box. She thought wildly, treacherously, of Darren Pike watching the river swallow the riverfront of the lofts he had promised to people who didn't know river stories. She pressed her cheek against the wheel and whispered, "This building is for making food and friends. It is not for drowning." The words fogged the metal and froze, then slid off into the water like sealant. The rope behind her trembled and then held steady. She could feel the weight of the entire room through it, the way they had all taken one breath together and were holding it for her. She set her boots against the penstock wall,
found purchase in a line of old bolt heads, and pulled until her teeth felt like tools. Something moved, a half-inch. Water rushed like it had plans of its own, which of course it did. She lost her hold, caught it again, adjusted her grip, and made the wheel consider behaving. The current shoulder-checked her like a rude stranger on a busy street. She stayed, she pulled. A memory flashed. Knife oil on her father's workbench, the way he'd taught her to be gentle first and strong second. She softened her grip, listened for the complaint in the metal, then pressed where the complaint was born. The wheel moved another inch, and with it the sound in the penstock changed register, from threat to warning to possibility. Again, she told herself, and the word echoed in her mouth like prayer, pretending not to be prayer. Her fingers slipped. She corrected. Behind her, a cheer from the room filtered down the pipe as a long, low vibration, a human sound translated into architecture. Then the rope snapped sideways, a tiny jerk that said emergency without melodrama. Something hit the outside wall, maybe a log, maybe a sign the river was bringing back from some other town. The penstock shuddered. The wheel bit back. Kezia's shoulder screamed the language her mouth did not speak. She tasted iron as if she had invented it. She leaned into the pain like it had rent due. Now, she said, not sure who she was ordering, and her fingers closed around the rusted wheel, and she began to turn.
Turn, inch by aching inch, until the valve's protest lowered from a scream to a groan, and the river's fist unclenched around her ribs. Water shouldered past her thighs in a rush that made the penstock tremble, then steadied as the pressure found a way home. Keziah braced, pulled again, and the wheel obeyed, this time with the dazed compliance of something that had forgotten it could. She didn't let go, not yet. She counted to 7 the way Rook had taught her to count when patience was the only tool left. Slow, deliberate, like unspooling thread so it doesn't knot on itself. At 5, the current shifted. At 6, it eased. At 7, the whole building exhaled and became a room again instead of a question. She backed out the way she'd come, calves burning, palms raw under the gloves, teeth chattering with an exhaustion that felt clean. The rope drew her into lamplight and heat and the anxious silence of a crowd pretending not to pray. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Hands were on her before her knees remembered how to be knees. Rooks steady as fixtures. Lead as brisk and blessing in the same motion. Orens in the small of her back guiding, lifting. Someone wrapped her in a thermal blanket that crinkled like stubborn paper. The room made the soft sound people make when the thing they hoped would happen finally does, and they're embarrassed by how much they wanted it. "Valves open," Keziah said, breath fogging the words. "We're stable for now. We'll need a welder and a chain lock with a temper." Rook grunted, which in his language was celebration. "You just taught her manners," he said, meaning the river or the mill or both. "She'll remember, for a while." They moved. Tarps came down. Flour rose back to its shelves. A volunteer with neat handwriting amended the whiteboard. Floodwatch to Flood Watched. Oren hung a sign at the back door that read in Sharpie, "If you're not here to help, you're already late." Keziah showered in the little stall they'd installed for exactly this kind of day and watched mud turn the water into tea. She changed into the spare clothes she kept in a bin labeled, "In case she forgets she's human," and came back to the kitchen to find that the line had not left, only knit itself tighter. Huerta arrived with her hair wet from snow and her eyes set to stern. She took in the damp floors, the coiled hoses, the way the volunteers had moved perishables up and chemicals higher. Then her face did the softening it did when the math worked in favor of survival. "You called," she said, though Keziah hadn't reached her in time, and they both knew it. "I will apologize to your voicemail until we're old," Keziah said. You can start by apologizing with a bowl of whatever smells like salvation, Huerta replied, hanging her coat by the door. And then documentation, photos, times, names. I'll help you write it for the city. She picked up a mop without waiting for permission. Feed first, she added. Paper second. They fed first. The soup had the green of hope and the heft of potatoes. Bread split in hands as if it had been waiting for the right palms. A teenager in a too-thin hoodie asked if he could take an extra for his neighbor, and then cried when Keziah said, "Take two," because permission sometimes releases tears the way heat releases fragrance. When the rush thinned, they wrote. Brooke diagrammed the wheel's mischief. Lita listed what the roof had done under snow load like she was filing a character witness for a friend. Oren documented the improvised sandbag line with the pride of a man who had learned late that he belonged in plans. After midnight, when the last pot was soaking and the last coat had been reclaimed from the hook line, and the mill's hum had returned to its steady domestic pitch, Keziah sat alone at the card table with her notebook open. The penstock water had found its way under the cuticle of her right thumb, and the sting pulsed with her pulse. She rested the tip of the pen on the page and let the ink puddle there, a small dark lake that did not need to be named. She thought of the three boys with Pike's card. She thought of the lock on the river gate and the neatness of its cut. She thought of the way the city had said morning like it was a promise and not a delay that costs. She wasn't a person who ached for revenge. She ached for continuity, but continuity required interruptions to be named. She wrote, "Who cut the lock?" Underlined it, then underlined it again. The second line was not for anger. It was for attention. Morning brought a sky the color of dishwater that hadn't yet learned discipline. The river had settled into her banks with a grudging elegance. A city truck pulled up with two men whose uniforms said Public Works and whose expressions said, "We are ready to be hated." Keziah met them at the gate with a thermos and the version of her smile that made room for skepticism without feeding it. "Miss Moreland," the taller one said, taking the thermos like he hadn't expected to be handed anything, "I'm Ortiz. This is Peppers. We got your messages. Our apologies for the delay." "I'm glad you're here," Keziah said, and meant it. "We documented what we could. The wheel was jammed. The lock was cut. We closed it enough to keep the building. We need a permanent fix. Welded cap, chain, an upstream camera with a mind of its own." Peppers crouched by the gate and whistled between his teeth. "Somebody loved this steel once," he said, tracing a finger along a line of rivets. "We can love her again. We'll weld today. Cam will need a request, but I know a guy." Ortiz eyed the broken lock. "I know a guy too," he said, and the tone had double weight. "We'll file the report." They worked. Sparks lit the river wall in brief constellations. The smell of hot metal turned the cold air sweet in the way only danger and skill can. By noon, the gate had a new mouth. No place for a bolt cutter to bite. The men ate soup off the loading dock and didn't notice they were sitting under the word "Friends" painted on the lintel. Or maybe they did and were polite enough not to point at it. News travels in towns the way steam travels in old pipes, with a hiss, with warmth, with the occasional knock. By late afternoon, the councilwoman, whose district included the riverfront, stood in the doorway of the mill, stomping snow off her boots. Her scarf was the color of fresh cherries. "You caused a mild uproar," she told Keziah without preamble. "Was it mild because no one drowned?" Keziah asked. "Because you kept receipts," the councilwoman said. She smiled, a small, private smile that made room for both amusement and respect. "I've got a meeting with Pike tomorrow about his complaint." "Which one?" Keziah asked, too quickly. The last of her patience with that man had crusted and needed steam. "He alleges your project is attracting crime and lowering property values along a developing corridor." She rolled her eyes. "He loves the word corridor, makes him feel like an emperor in a hallway." Keziah looked at the ovens. They were breathing slowly now, ready for the next life they'd be asked to coax into flavor. "What should I do?" she asked. "Keep feeding people," the councilwoman said, "and come to the meeting. Bring Huerta, bring your data, bring one of your Thursday grandmothers with the quiet voice that makes everyone feel like they're being watched by God." Thursday's grandmother was named Delphine.
She came every week with a folded napkin for wrapping leftovers and a sentence or two that seemed too small to carry the weight they did. When Kezia asked if she would come, Delphine patted her hand and said, "Child, I have been waiting to go to one of those rooms since they built them." The meeting happened in the old train depot they used for public theater and public outrage. The room had too much echo and too much air conditioning. Pike sat at the end of a long table wearing a suit that cost a month's worth of flour and the expression of a man who considered empathy a liability. He spoke first because men like him practice being the first voice in a room. He intoned, "My company has invested significant capital to rescue our riverfront from decay. We've welcomed community assets, but the mill project, while well-intentioned, is proving to be a magnet for loitering, littering, and," he glanced at notes he didn't need, "public nuisance." Delphine stood before anyone could invite her. She did not walk to the podium. She spoke from where she was, third row, aisle seat, purse hook on the chair in front of her, like a woman testifying in church to a God who understood logistics. If a man is hungry and you call him a nuisance, the nuisance is you. A little ripple ran through the room. The councilwoman did not smile, but her pen paused in its necessary bureaucratic scratching. Huerta presented the health data, no reported illnesses, temperature logs pristine, pest control documented like a legal thriller. Ortiz testified to the welded gate. Peppers spoke about the camera going up next week and how the city had failed response time and would fix it. Kezia showed maps with pins and numbers with commas, loaves delivered, gallons ladled, volunteer hours, farmers paid, electricity generated by a river that had been bored. Pike leaned back, made a staple of his fingers, and smiled like a blade. "Laudable," he said, "but misplaced. Charity belongs in churches and shelters, not on prime riverfront." Kezia felt her molars meet. She breathed out through her nose and saw her mother's hands knotting bread dough on a chipped counter. "Bread belongs where people can get it, and we aren't a charity, we are a commons, a place that insists the distance between hunger and food is measurable and fixable." A man in a bait shop jacket stood up from the back. "You're going to outlaw fishing next? The underpass scares some folks. You want to put a velvet rope there too?" Laughter, but the kind that takes sides. The councilwoman rapped her pen once, a sound that managed to be both punctuation and grace. "Mr. Pike, your complaint is noted. So is your timing, which seems to coincide with a cut lock on a river gate and a flood that might have eaten your corridor if not for the mill's quick response." Pike's smile wavered 1 degree. "Are you implying—"
"I am implying nothing," the councilwoman said. "I am explicitly stating that our city owes the mill staff a thank you and perhaps a budget line for emergency response we apparently cannot manage within our own departments." She turned to Kezia. "We will not be taking action on Mr. Pike's complaint. We will be drafting a partnership memo with your project. Please bring me a list of what you need the city to stop bungling." Delphine put her hand over her heart and said, "Amen," and nobody told her to be quiet because it wasn't church. After the meeting, Pike brushed past Kezia like a man dodging weather he had not ordered. "You won this round," he murmured, "but your project creates dependency. People will expect this forever. What happens when you burn out?" Kezia didn't answer immediately. She looked at his shoes, which were not built for riverbanks. She looked past him to where Delphine was hugging Huerta as if they had been neighbors since infancy. She thought of Rook's hands on the wheel, of Lita's command, of Oren's careful lists, of the boy with the hoodie crying over a second loaf. "I am not the project," she said finally. "We are. That's the part you don't understand because no one has ever made you food when you didn't deserve it." He flinched, not at the accusation, but at the word deserve. Then he smoothed his face back into something expensive and left before his expression could betray what it felt like to be named. The winter deepened, and the mill learned new routines for bitter days. The coat rack doubled. A volunteer rigged a hot water loop under the prep table for hands that needed thawing. An old band from the VFW came on Tuesdays to play songs that had learned to outlive their wars. The turbines sang lower, and Kezia could tell by sound alone when the upstream ice was thick enough to make power stumble. She had never been an engineer in school. She had become one by respect. Neighbors who had frowned at first now nodded without remembering they used to frown. The paper that had called her rot ran a new headline that made up for nothing and helped anyway. Mill feeds thousands, river powers ovens. The picture showed Keziah mid-ladle, eyes soft, mouth determined, hair barely contained by a bandana that Delphine had sewn for her in a fabric the color of ripe tomatoes. A bus from the city 2 towns over arrived one Saturday with a church group who wanted to help the poor. Keziah met them at the door with hairnets and a talk about verbs. We say work with, not help. We say neighbors, not clients. We say line, not queue, because we are not an airport and nobody here is boarding a better life on standby. The church group blushed, then listened, then worked like they had walked into a class that wanted them to pass. March arrived carrying thaw and trouble. One of the 3 boys came back without his friends and without cockiness. He stood by the door and shuffled his feet and said, "My mom's sick," like he was admitting to arson. Keziah put him to work at the bagging table. "What's her name?" she asked. "Lupita," he said, and the syllables made his lip wobble. "She don't eat, says I should." "Then we're feeding both of you, no arguments. Can you read this label?" He could. She nodded. "Your lead on allergens today, most important job in the room." He stood up taller in a way that made his collarbones look less like bird wings. Rook and Oren finished shoring the south wall. Lita built a sled-track pulley for hauling sacks to the 2nd floor that made teenagers volunteer for chores because it felt like piloting the Dragon. Huerta organized a surprise inspection of their grease trap and then gave Keziah a thumbs up that the room cheered like a goal. The night before Spring Festival, when they planned to cook outside and teach anyone with hands how to braid challah, the mill went dark. Not the blip of a brownout, dark like a story that hadn't been written yet. The turbine was fine. The panel was not. The breaker had tripped and refused to be untripped. Rook frowned at it like a doctor meeting a rare rash. "She's too hot," he said. "Something's drawing load like a greedy child." They split into search parties. Lita followed a warmth along the conduit to the upstairs grain room. Oren opened the door and hissed, "Shut it down. Now." A decades-old fluorescent ballast no one had remembered was hiding in the ceiling insulation was cooking itself toward catastrophe. The smell of it was plastic failures and almost burn. Keziah grabbed the dry chem extinguisher and felt the old training kick, the one she'd taken before anyone would let her sign a lease as the responsible party. She nodded to Lita. Lita killed the breaker. Keziah pulled the pin, aimed, squeezed, swept. White grit coated the ballast and the nearest beams like a winter. The room held its breath. The smell shifted from promise to past tense. Keziah lowered the extinguisher and realized she was shaking. Rook's hand was on her shoulder. "You walked into the pipe," he said, voice a stone in a river. "You can do this, too." "I don't want to be good at emergencies," she said, and then laughed because she meant it, also didn't. "I want to be boring." Boring feeds poorly, which was the closest he would ever come to a joke. They slept that night in shifts, the mill a bivouac of cots and alarms set for 2-hour rounds. At dawn, they opened as if nothing had tried to become something else. Bread rose. Coffee made the air polite. Children arrived with hands ready for flour, and grandmothers arrived with stories about braids that had kept names alive through worse winters than this one. At noon, the councilwoman cut a ribbon, because a grant required a ribbon to be cut to justify the commas. Delphine didn't cut anything. She stood next to Keziah and squeezed her elbow once and said, "God keeps making mornings. All you have to do is keep making bread." The day stretched long and clean. Keziah lost count at 1,200 loaves because counting wasn't the point. A man carrying everything he owned in a backpack sat at the edge of the crowd and watched with eyes ready to run. She brought him a plate and then another, and did not ask him any questions that would make him feel examined. He asked them anyway in the quiet grammar of the grateful. "You open tomorrow?" "Every day. That's the point." Summer returned wearing a different face than the one that had watched her sign the deed. The city and the mill signed the partnership memo in a ceremony that made Keziah itch.
the way attention itches when the work is the thing that deserves the clapping. The memo gave them a seat in emergency planning, a reimbursement rate for meals during declared heat waves and cold snaps, a number to call that was answered by a person who could say yes. It also put their name on a list Pike would read with his morning coffee and glare at. He tried one last time, lawsuit this time, dressed in paper with shoes that didn't squeak. Public nuisance, it said again, as if repeating a spell could make it true. Exceeds allowed occupancy. Unsafe crowding. Attracts vagrancy. Huerta sat with Keziah and a pro bono attorney named Joy, who wore her hair in the practical bun of women who expect men to interrupt them and like making them regret it. Joy scratched notes while Keziah described the flow of the room during peak hours. "We can design the crowd out of his complaint," she said. "Lines outside become numbered tickets with return times, pop-up canopies for shade, volunteers trained as ushers. It's a theater. We know how to seat a theater."
They did. The line became an orchestra warm-up turned symphony, each section entering in time. No crowding, no clots, no chaos to photograph for a judge. Pike's lawyer submitted printouts anyway. Joy submitted counters with the cold charm of a woman who had learned to win without raising her voice. The judge dismissed the suit with language that sounded faintly annoyed at being asked to waste time. In August, a heat wave dragged itself across town and tried to drape over the mill like a drunk guest. Keziah worked with Ortiz to turn the turbine room into an air-conditioned refuge. Cool air pulled across river-chilled coils and pushed up through vents like mercy. People came with faces shining and hands swollen. They drank water until their bodies remembered water was allowed. They ate cold soup and sat with their backs against cool brick and did not apologize for taking up space. Some nights, after the last mop had found the last spill and the last pan had stopped insisting on being cleaned again, Keziah would walk to the river and sit on the wall with her feet dangling above the black water. She'd count the bats and the blessings in the same register. She would think of her mother's hands again and the word failure and the better word, compost. She would think of the boy who'd cried and the first raccoon print and the way Delphine's amen had sounded like a gavel. On one of those nights, footsteps approached in a rhythm that belonged to someone who believed the world belonged to him. She did not turn until he spoke. "You built a machine," Darren Pike said, coming to stand beside her as if they had met here by appointment. "It eats money and gives you applause. How long until the money runs out?" Keziah didn't answer. The river had more interesting things to say. "I'll make you an offer," he said after the quiet failed to make her feel it. "Sell me the building. I'll lease it back to you for $1 a year. You expand in a new space I provide. You get stability, I get optics." She laughed. It surprised them both. "You want to use us to sell your hallways." "I want to add an amenity to my development," he said, and looked at the word amenity like a coin. She turned then and met his eyes. He held her gaze because he was good at holding gazes and making people forget to blink. "Darren," she said, tasting his first name as if it had a secret in it. "There are 1,000 ways to dress a hunger. Some of them are fancy. None of them feed." He stiffened. The name had landed where names land when you say them like you know who you're talking to. "You think you're better than commerce. I think bread is older, and I think this building belongs to the ones who don't make you money. That makes it dangerous to you." "It makes it sentimental," he snapped. "It makes it a city, and a city is a body. You can't cut off the hands that feed it and call that an investment." He left in a noise of expensive frustration. She watched his back and felt, not triumph exactly, relief. You don't have to win against a man like that. You have to outlast his attention span. Fall came, smelling like apples and titanium from the kindergarten class that toured the mill and then tried to eat the bowls. The ovens ran on schedules that looked like calculus and sounded like laughter. The turbine needed a bearing and got one, and Rook kissed the new part like a grandchild and pretended later he hadn't. Oren started teaching Saturday repair clinic because everything in a kitchen wants to break when it most wants to be useful. On a windy afternoon, the boy with Lupita for a mother found Kezia by the flower bins. He said, "She's better," he said, shy again but not brittle. "She says thank you." Kezia bent to eye level. "Tell her we said you did most of it," she said, "because you did." He grinned, and the grin rebuilt something in her that the pipe had scraped raw. The first anniversary arrived, and nobody had time to do anything about it until Delphine brought in a cake so large it had moods. The frosting read, in piping that wobbled but held, "You kept your promises." Kezia cut the first slice, and then the next, and then cried in the dry, efficient way her body preferred, tears that traveled in straight lines and did not require anyone to fuss. After the cake, when the room returned to being a mill and a kitchen and a commons and whatever words someone needed it to be that day, Kezia slipped out to the river again. The gate gleamed with its weld like a scar that had decided to be proud. The water stroked the wall, patient, old, unbothered by lawsuits and letters. She felt footsteps again, but soft this time, and turned to find Delphine with 2 mugs. "You looked like a woman who needs to be handed a hot thing," Delphine said. "I have been that woman." They sat in a silence that owed nobody anything. Finally, Delphine said, "People think miracles are loud." Kezia smiled into her mug. "People think a lot of things." "Quiet ones last longer," Delphine said. "This here is a quiet one. You hear it?" Kezia listened. The turbine hummed a sea. The ovens ticked as they cooled. Somewhere inside, someone knocked a spoon against a pot in a rhythm that would soon become a song. The river insisted on being the river. Bread cooled on racks in lines that would make a quilt jealous. The mill breathed. "I hear it," she said. Winter would come again. Floods would come again. Pike would try again, or someone like him would, because corridors love emperors. Mistakes would get made and learned from. Bearings would need replacing, and volunteers would need reminding, and Huerta would leave a note with a dot that said stern and a smile that said proud. And tomorrow, people would show up in coats and sweaters and nerves and hunger and ask without asking if the door would open. It would. Kezia stood. "Back to work," she said to no one and to everyone, and went inside to write tomorrow on the whiteboard and text the farmers and check the valve wheel one more time with her fingertips, the way a mother checks a sleeping child's temperature. The mill ticked. The river talked. The town made a sound that was not applause or argument, but appetite met with answer. The work moved forward, not like a parade, not like a charge, but like kneaded dough. Pressed, rested, pressed again, rising in its own time into something that could feed thousands without keeping score.